I have been making this artisan sourdough bread for about 5 years, and I'm going to show you my process today. If you're just here for the recipe, I will put it in the description because this is a long video where I talk a lot and share all my tips and tricks and successes and failures with sourdough. So feel free to watch and see my method, or just check the description for my recipe. Oh, and I had neglected my starter for like a week before I filmed this video, so I'll be talking about rebuilding a neglected starter as well. All right, it has been 24 hours since I cleaned out my nasty neglected starter and fed it. And it's a little bit better, but it's still looking pretty sad. So it did, oops, drop something. It did rise just a little, and bubble just a little bit yesterday. And now it's very liquidy. So I'm going to, and the smell is still, it's not as bad as yesterday, but it's not right. It's not what it should be. So I'm actually going to switch the container again and put it into something clean, just a little bit of this into something clean, feed it, and see where we're at later today and tomorrow. So we are on day 2. Starter is in a clean container, nice and thick, and we'll see where we're at later today. Good morning. It is bright and early. Yesterday was day 3 of rebuilding my starter, and I didn't film it. I didn't expect much since the first 2 days. It was still smelling kind of weird, and I was getting a little bit of activity, but I was like, oh man, this is gonna take like a week to rebuild this. But yesterday, this is stuck to the top. You can see that I ended up with a lot of activity. My starter was back to normal. It was just fine. So I actually used some of it last night. It is, let's see, 6 a.m. I'm gonna feed this now, and we are gonna be ready to go today because this took no time yesterday to bubble up and be at its peak. So, you know, at 6 a.m., if I feed this now, I'm gonna put it in a clean jar too. As you can see, I need to do that. Then when we get home from the gym around noon, I think my starter will be ready to go, and I'll get my bread ready. I will let it cold proof in the fridge overnight tonight, and then I will bake tomorrow morning. And this is usually my personal routine, so I'll put it in the description. But usually, you have to have a strong starter for this. That way, it doesn't take forever for it to peak after a feeding. So my typical routine is that I will feed my starter early in the morning, and then early afternoon, I start my bread and I do the bulk ferment process. I do the shaping. I put it in my banneton basket, let it cold proof overnight, and then I'm ready to bake in the morning. Let's transfer this. Let's feed it and check on it this afternoon. You don't have to mark your jar with a marker or rubber band, and I almost never do, but I am today just for the purpose of showing you how much it grows. It is 9:30, so it has been 3.5 hours since I fed my starter. We're actually getting ready to leave, and I'm not going to use it until I get back. But you can see that it's already pretty active here. I did put a rubber band, where it was on the level it was when I first fed it. So it's definitely doubled, but this will grow more and be even more active by the time we get back, and it will be ready to use. I just got home, and you can see that the good old starter has grown even more. It is peaked, it is ready to go. So I'm going to start my bread here, and I've shared before, but my method of making, I've been making, artisan, if you want to call this artisan sourdough bread since we moved in here, so 5 or 6 years, and my method is just not very scientific. I don't use a scale. A couple years ago, I thought that I needed to get fancy, and I tried using a scale, and it actually gave me worse results, I think because I'm just so used to doing it my way. So I don't use a scale, and I don't really measure. I really just go by the look of the dough, because on any given day, my starter might be at a little bit different hydration level than the next day because I don't measure when I feed my starter either. When I make my artisan bread, I am going for a more of a tight closed crumb. So if you've looked at pictures of sourdough, you'll know that, you know, a lot of people really like a big open crumb where there are big holes in the sourdough. Well, you know, I personally would love that, and I you know what, I'll make that for you guys sometime. I know how to make my bread do that. There's flies everywhere in my house. But you know, for everyday bread, when my husband and my kids are eating it too, a lot of times I'm making sandwiches or I'm making toast and I'm putting butter and jelly and, you know, condiments on the bread. And when there are big holes, that's just not practical. So I like a tight closed crumb. And to achieve that, I go for a drier dough. So my dough is not as elastic as you might see, you know, some people make theirs. It's a very dense, dry dough, but the bread doesn't end up dense. It's still really light and fluffy and soft. It's just got the closed crumb. So let's get started here. Now, I think I told you guys that I, within like a few week period, broke all of my big mixing bowls. I really wanted to replace them just by hitting the thrift shops and finding more vintage bowls, but I have had absolutely no luck. So I did break down and I ordered some mixing bowls. They're not here yet. So I'm using my Dutch ovens to serve as mixing bowls right now. It's fine, it'll work just fine. So I'm gonna start with my water. This is just lukewarm water. I don't measure the temperature, just make sure it's not hot. Technically, you don't want it to be over 110 degrees. That's really the cutoff because then it will kill the yeast in your starter. So this is a pint jar. And like I said, I never measure, but I know a pint is 2 cups. And this is just short of that. Maybe it's a cup and a half, something like that. So I'm going to pour this in. And I hear a sibling death match going on now. So hopefully everybody's okay back there. Next, I'm gonna add my starter. So this is about 2 cups of active starter, and I'm just gonna pour some in. Sourdough professionals are dying right now at my lack of measuring. So I don't know, just pouring some in here. There will be some left. Some will be left in there. And then when all this comes down from the sides, I'll have about that much left so I can feed it again. And that will be plenty. I've got my starter, which is floating in my water. So good old float test. You want your starter to be really light and bubbly and airy and float in your water, you know. That's just one way, you know, it's ready to bake with. So I'm just gonna mix my starter into my water here. And then the next step is to add flour. So this next step, adding your flour, is really going to determine the you know, consistency and crumb of your bread. At least in my experience, that's what determines it the most is your flour to water ratio. As long as you have a strong starter, you can get a good loaf. Just the crumb, you know, that's what's going to vary. And you know, speaking of having a strong starter, there's my starter. You know, I think when I read that people are struggling to make sourdough bread, I think a lot of times that is the problem, is the starter itself. It's not their technique, it's not anything else they're doing, because when you have a really strong starter, it's really hard to go wrong. You might not get the exact, you know, result that you desire, but you're gonna get something that should taste good. It should proof in a decent amount of time. So I think a lot of times it's just a really hungry starter. It's a starter that is being fed too much water, not enough flour, so it's a really thin consistency, which you can get away with later on down the road when your starter's established. You can feed it more water and have that thin, runny consistency if you want it that way for a certain recipe or something. But when you're getting your starter established, it's hungry. It wants to feed on the flour. So make sure it's really, really thick, more flour than water, like, you know, thicker than pancake batter almost, to where it's sticking to your spoon. You kind of saw that I still feed my starter that way most of the time. It's super thick. So you saw when I was putting, after I fed this morning, I put it in this quart jar and it was super thick. You want it like that. And you know, in the beginning, when you're discarding, I have blog posts on starting a sourdough starter. Maybe someday we'll do a video on that where I do, you know, a few different kinds of starters like rye and all-purpose and einkorn, because I've done them all and it's really fun. And I'll show you the process, but check out my blog posts. But anyway, it does take time. You know, your starter might be ready to use for basic things like pancakes or discard recipes or sweetbreads after the first week or so, but it might take a couple weeks, even a month, for it to be ready to bake a really good artisan loaf with. And that whole time you are feeding aggressively. You don't want, the whole time you're establishing a brand new starter, you don't want it to lie dormant for a very long time at all. So after it peaks and it comes back down, you want to discard and feed again and use that discard. And don't throw the discard away. I mean, if you have chickens or pigs or something, you can give it to them so you're not wasting, but don't throw your discard away. Get really good at discard recipes, because as long as you have a sourdough starter, you are going to have discard time to time when you don't get around to using your starter like you thought you would. And it's just nice to have discard recipes on hand. And there are, 5 million of them floating around. But the moral of the story is it takes time to get an established starter, and you really need to be diligent in the beginning when you are getting it established by, not letting it lie dormant, making sure it's a higher flour to water ratio, and really just being patient. Well, enough talking. We're gonna get on to adding the flour. So, I usually start with about 3 cups. I just keep a measuring cup here in my flour canister. So I start with about 3 cups of flour and see if I need to add any more. Sometimes I mix my flours, not really on purpose, but I refill my canister, and it's just a different type of flour. So depending on what type of flour you're using, you might add more or less. That's why I don't really like to use recipes with scales where you're weighing everything out. And that can also vary depending on what elevation you're at. So I know there are some really amazing ladies who live like up in the mountains, and they show their beautiful sourdough all the time and share their recipe with the weight for measurements. And people who do not live at that elevation just struggle. It does not work for them at all. So in my mind, it just makes more sense to go by the look and feel of the dough than to weigh everything out. And as I tell my daughter, I'm teaching her, she's 10, so she's learning all this stuff, learning how to bake, how to cook. You can always add more, but you can't take it away. So that's really true with flour when you are baking, especially when you're baking sourdough bread. Just, you can always add more, you can't take it away. So don't get too overzealous when you're adding your flour. Add maybe 2 cups, start mixing, see what your consistency is looking like, then maybe add that 3rd cup. If you need more, you can add a little bit more at a time, but don't go crazy and add it all in the beginning. Even if you are a person who really likes using precise measurements, that's fine. Weigh out your flour, but don't add it all at once, because like I said, there could be some kind of variable at your elevation or with your starter to where if you just dump all that flour in that you weighed, then it's gonna be off. Your dough is gonna be off. So as you can see here, and you can probably hear the sibling death match is still going on in the background. I am at the very bottom of my canister, and I think I've got a couple different kinds of flour in here. See, there's like maybe a whole wheat at the bottom and then some all-purpose unbleached, who knows. So this is going to be particularly a good time to just watch how my dough comes together, because I'm mixing flours. I just want to use what's in here. All right, so I got my first cup here. We'll do 2 cups. I know 2 cups is, fine. So I'll go ahead and put 2 full cups in here, start mixing, and just kind of see what things are looking like. Mixing here. Now, I don't add my salt just yet. You'll see. I let mine rest for a bit. I just do water, starter, and flour. Let that rest. We'll come back and we'll do the salt later. So this dough is not where I want it, and I knew that because this is only 2 cups. But like I said, you can always add more. Okay, so see, this is a very hydrated dough, very sticky. I want mine shaggy. So let's just do another cup of flour. A scant cup. We'll add more if we need to. So stir this up, see what it looks like. All right, now I do not want to overmix here. I just want to make sure that there's, all the flour is kind of incorporated. But don't want to start basically kneading. Everything will come together as it sits. I'm just gonna add a little bit more flour. So that was, that last cup was, not a full cup. This is probably 3 full cups of flour. Maybe a little bit more. I know, if you're fancy,
you don't scoop your flour out like that. You spoon it into the measuring cup and you sift it. But we're not fancy here, so we don't do that. We don't have time to do that. And that is okay. You gotta do what you like and what works for you.
All right, so I ended up with about 3 cups of flour as usual. So you can see this is a pretty dry dough, but it will get more workable as it sits. I'm gonna let it sit for 30 minutes. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about salt. So far this is, let's just say about 1.5 cups, maybe 1 3/4 cup, something like that, of water, just lukewarm water. Then some sourdough starter, anywhere between 1/2 cup and a cup, who knows? I just keep pouring. If you're looking at the feel of the bread, you'll know when you have enough flour to make it work. And then, you know, for me, this was about 3 cups of flour, but I want a shaggy dough, okay? You can see that not all the little bits of flour are worked in, and that's just fine. So I'm gonna cover this, let it sit. We'll be back in 30 minutes. Now you can see just over the last 30 minutes that this dough has become a lot more elastic just from resting. So I added a tablespoon of salt, and I'm just gonna mix the salt in, not kneading, just getting it all to come together. And then I'm going to start my bulk ferment process with a series of stretch and folds. You don't have to use a proofing box like I'm using, but you know, it's fall, it's chilly. I've got the windows open in my house, so it's in the 60s in my house. So I am using my proofer, but you could use your oven. Don't put it on too high. Maybe just like 75 or 80 or something. So I'm just doing some stretch and folds here, just two or three stretch and folds. Just stretch your dough and then fold it over onto yourself. Then I put it back in the proofer, let it sit for another 30 minutes. Now I'm going to stretch and fold again, and look how elastic this started. Do you remember it started off really shaggy and dry and like looked like it was unworkable, but now it's so elastic and stretchy. So it's gonna go back in the proofer, and we're gonna do one last stretch and fold. So I do a total of 3 stretch and folds every 30 minutes over the first hour and a half, and then I let my dough proof until it is almost doubled in size and it's looking nice and light and fluffy and airy, and it's got some bubbles in it. You don't want to go too long or it'll start to fall flat. Now I'm going to turn it out and shape it. So this is just 1 loaf. A lot of recipes make 2 loaves, but when you're practicing, don't use that much flour because you're going to need some practice to get good. Just make 1 loaf. Make recipes that have enough ingredients for just 1 loaf at the beginning. So I shape my loaf by stretching my dough into a square and then doing a burrito fold. Wow, I call it a burrito fold. Just kind of fold it over on itself and then roll it up. That's it. Tuck the corners in, and then I do this little move here, kind of like spinning and tucking the corners in to create tension so that the loaf is sealed on the bottom. Now I'm just gonna sprinkle some flour on and actually let this rest here on the counter for about 30 minutes before it goes into the basket. And see, I've got some nice bubbles forming there on the surface. You know, this is a perfectly proofed loaf right there. All right, so see, it already kind of rose back up in just that 30 minutes that it was sitting on the counter after I shaped it. Now I'm going to turn it over into my banneton basket. You don't have to specifically have a banneton basket. You can use a paper bowl or any kind of bowl with a towel in it. That will work. So don't think you need to buy fancy tools. I didn't have a bench scraper or baskets or a proofing box or anything for the first couple of years. I just used what I had. And even to this day, when we travel, I will bring my sourdough starter and some flour, and I'll just use whatever they have at whatever Airbnb we stay at. So I'm gonna let this cold proof overnight, and I will see you in the morning. I was supposed to see you yesterday morning after letting my bread proof overnight, but it's been 2 days. Yesterday, we just had a change of plans. Things got busy and I didn't bake my bread, but it's fine. It's fine to cold proof in the fridge for you know, it'll be good in there for a few days. This will not be overproofed, it'll be just fine. But since it was in there a little bit longer, I'm going to put it in the fridge while I preheat my Dutch oven, and then I will pull it out, score it, and we will be ready to go. This is actually going to be the first time that I'm using my new bread oven that I got at Aldi. And I think that this was a few weeks that you guys saw the video by now, but it's just kind of confusing to me because I don't always film things in the order that I send them out to you all. So I didn't film that long ago, and I'm just now getting around using this beauty for the first time. So this was what, $24 at Aldi? This is enamel coated cast iron. And I've always just used a regular Dutch oven. I've never baked bread in one of these, so I'm excited to give it a shot. I'm just gonna preheat this at 425 and get it nice and hot. My oven is preheated. It is time to score this loaf. Now, I am not a fancy scorer because I'm just not a very artistic person, to be honest. I see some of the fancy scores that people do, and I love them and appreciate them, and I try them, and they don't look good. So maybe I just need practice, or maybe I just need to accept that. Right now I'm in the phase of acceptance, so I've just accepted that I'm not good at it, and I do very basic scores that are still pretty. So don't be intimidated if you see these just like amazing, super fancy patterns. You don't need to do that to get a really good loaf that tastes amazing. You know, it's going to taste the same. Well, you do need to score because you need to allow for expansion. So that's what I'm doing. I've got my blade here, and this is what I do most often is 3 big scores, one right down the center and one on either side. It just allows for a lot of expansion. Never does me wrong. My loaf always ends up the way that I like it, so I stick with this. And, you know, it's not the most beautiful thing in the world, but you'll see when it's finished, it's not bad. Now, as I said, I bake at 425, but depending on where you live and your oven, you might need to bake at a lot higher temperature. A lot of people bake it up to like 500 degrees. Some people do 475, some 450. Some start at 475 and lower it down to 425. There are all kinds of methods, so you just have to kind of play with it. So, you know, if you find that your loaf is way too brown and crispy, you can try baking it covered for a longer time. You'll see what I mean. So I'm going to bake my loaf here, and I'm going to cover it. I bake mine covered for 30 to 35 minutes. And then I uncover it, and this is all done for me personally in my oven at 425, okay? So see, this has been baking for 30 minutes. Then I uncover it and put it back in and bake for another 10 minutes. But this is trial and error. I think the first recipe I used, it said bake at 500 and cover for 25, uncover for 15. My loaf was like a brick, and it was like black. So that doesn't work for me. You might have to play with it, but look at this. This was baked, covered for 30 minutes at 425, uncovered for another 10, still at 425, and you know, this is how I like it, just perfect. It's got a nice, crispy, golden crust that's not going to chip your teeth. It's, you know, aesthetically pleasing. It's not like burnt looking. It's got a good shape. It has good expansion in the scores. And I'll show you the crumb here that I was talking about, this more of a closed crumb. You can still see that it was an active starter because you've got a couple of the holes, but you've got a good closed crumb that is great for sandwiches, for toast, for butter bread. And in fact, that's what I'm gonna do right now. I did let this loaf rest. You need to let your loaf rest because it actually continues baking even after it comes out of the oven before you cut into it. So don't cut into it right away. I let mine rest for like an hour. It's hard to do when it looks so delicious, but you got to do it. So see, this bread is just so soft, and it's just like a really good sandwich bread when you start off the way that I did with the really shaggy dough and do my no frills method here, but you got to have that strong starter. So I've got some raw fresh butter here, some flaky salt, which is always necessary. And, you know, I'm going to go ahead and enjoy this delicious piece of homemade bread. Well, I hope this was helpful for you guys. I will type out my recipe and my process in the description below. All right, well, I will see you next week.